He had no idea that the only person who could save his son was the one he'd just pushed away. Richard Beaumont's face hardened as he stood at the open front door of his mansion. The early evening light cast long shadows across the polished marble foyer. Just outside, Grace, his son's dedicated nurse, stood with trembling lips and tears welling in her eyes. She clutched her coat and a small bag, stunned by what had just happened. "I don't ever want to see you here again," Richard hissed, his voice low and seething with anger. 6-year-old Henry peeked from behind his father's legs, his big blue eyes full of confusion and fear. Grace opened her mouth to speak, to plead or explain. She wasn't even sure which. But Richard cut her off with an upraised hand. "Enough!" he snapped. "You've done more than enough. Leave now." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She blinked back tears, casting one last desperate glance past Richard toward the little boy. Henry reached out a small hand as if wanting to go to her, his fingers trembling, but Richard held the door frame firmly, a wall between his son and the woman who had cared for him so lovingly. In that charged moment, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, as if the world itself knew a storm was coming. Grace finally nodded, wiping her cheek. With shaking steps, she turned and walked down the grand columned porch into the gathering dusk. Richard's cold gaze followed her until she disappeared beyond the iron gates. Then he exhaled sharply and slammed the heavy door shut with a resounding thud. He had won, or so he thought. Richard believed he was protecting his family's interest by throwing Grace out. But in reality, he had just banished the one person who might be able to save his child's life that very night, though he had no way of knowing that yet. The house fell silent, save for the ticking of an ornate clock and the faint, uneven breaths of a confused little boy. He had let his pride make the decision, and as the echoes of the slammed door faded, fate was already quietly arranging the consequences. If you believe in the power of compassion and second chances, consider subscribing. Earlier that day, the Beaumont mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, seemed almost peaceful. Grace had spent the morning patiently working with 6-year-old Henry, using picture cards and gentle encouragement to coax a few words and smiles from the shy boy. Henry, who was on the autism spectrum, rarely spoke around others, but with Grace he was beginning to open up. Richard Beaumont noticed this as he headed off to work. The 50-year-old hedge fund manager paused in the doorway, watching Grace help Henry stack some blocks. For a moment, Richard felt a glimmer of hope, but he quickly buried it under his stern demeanor, clearing his throat. "Don't coddle him too much," he warned Grace gruffly before leaving. "Make sure he does something productive today." Grace merely nodded, forcing a polite smile as the door closed. She knew Richard cared in his own way, but his idea of helping often clashed with hers. That evening, the tension that had been building finally snapped. Dinner at the Beaumonts was usually a formal affair, and tonight was no different. Fine china on a long mahogany table and an uncomfortable silence. Richard sat at the head, with his wife Elizabeth and Henry seated on either side. Grace stood by to help Henry with his meal. Midway through, Richard cleared his throat. "Henry," he said, trying to sound patient, "tell me one new thing you learned today." It was meant to be encouraging, but came out as a command. Henry froze, fidgeting with the little plush dinosaur in his lap. He glanced nervously at Grace, then down at his plate. The silence stretched. Grace knelt beside him and spoke softly, "It's okay, sweetie. You learned about the sun today, remember? You can tell Daddy that." She gently rubbed his back, trying to give him confidence, but under his father's intense gaze, Henry couldn't find his voice. His eyes welled with tears. Instead of speaking, he whimpered and pressed his face against Grace's arm, the toy dinosaur slipping from his grasp to the floor. Richard's jaw tightened. The faint hope he'd felt earlier vanished, replaced by frustration. "Unbelievable," he muttered, pushing his chair back suddenly. The abrupt noise made Henry flinch. "He's 6 years old and can't answer a simple question." Richard's tone was ice-cold. A long day at work had frayed his patience, and now home was offering no respite. Elizabeth shot her husband a sharp look. "Richard, please," she whispered, placing a comforting arm around Henry. "He's trying. Give him a moment." Henry was now quietly sobbing, upset by his father's anger. Richard ignored his wife and fixed his glare on Grace. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he said, voice low and angry. "All day with you, and this is what we get. He clings to you, but he won't talk to his own father." He tossed his napkin onto the table in disgust. "What exactly am I paying you for, Grace?" Grace felt a flush of hurt and embarrassment. She kept her voice calm. "Sir, Henry has been learning. He did great with his cards today, I swear." "Don't tell me about earlier," Richard snapped, cutting her off. "I'm seeing him now. He's terrified to say a word." He pointed sharply toward the doorway. "Go wait in the foyer, Grace, now." Grace's stomach dropped. She exchanged a frightened look with Elizabeth, who silently mouthed, "I'm sorry." Swallowing hard, Grace stood up and squeezed Henry's shoulder gently. "It's okay. I'll be right outside, honey," she whispered to the boy. Henry reached for her, but Grace had to turn and walk away. She hated leaving him like this, but Richard's order was not optional. Out in the grand foyer, Grace wrung her hands together, heart pounding. Muffled voices carried from the dining room. Richard and Elizabeth were arguing, though Grace couldn't make out the words. She caught only the tone, Richard's harsh and defensive, Elizabeth's pleading. Each passing second felt heavier than the last. At last, the door to the dining room swung open. Richard strode out, face grim, with Elizabeth trailing behind, tears in her eyes. Grace straightened up, hope and fear swirling inside her. "Mr. Beaumont," Grace began carefully, "I'm truly sorry Henry got upset. If you'll let me, I can work on this." Richard raised a hand to silence her. His eyes were cold and set. "This isn't about one outburst. It's about the lack of progress overall," he said, each word measured. "I hired you to help my son, and I'm not seeing it. Henry is as withdrawn as ever, maybe more so." Grace's throat tightened. "Sir, with respect, Henry is improving. He spoke to me today, and yesterday he laughed for the first time in months. These things take time." "I've heard enough," Richard interrupted, his voice like a blade. "I won't be lectured by the help. I'm his father, and I know what's best for him. Your services are no longer required." He nodded curtly toward the door. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Please," she whispered, tears forming. "Henry needs consistency. He trusts me. If I leave now—" "Henry will be fine," Richard said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. "We'll find someone else, someone who can actually get through to him." Elizabeth stepped forward, desperation on her face. "Richard, you're making a mistake," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "She loves him. He needs her." But Richard's mind was set. "It's done," he said firmly, avoiding Grace's eyes. He opened the heavy front door, gesturing for Grace to leave. At that moment, a small cry came from behind them. "Gracie!" Henry had slipped away from the dining room and stood there in the foyer, his tear-streaked face full of panic. In his tiny hands, he held the plush dinosaur. "Gracie, stay!" he begged in a broken voice that made Grace's heart shatter. It was the most clearly Henry had ever expressed what he wanted. Grace dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Henry ran to her, sobbing. She hugged him tightly, stroking his hair. "I'm here, baby, I'm here," she murmured, rocking him gently. Richard watched, his resolve wavering as his son clung to Grace like a lifeline. His throat worked as he struggled to speak. "Henry," he began, stepping forward. He had never heard Henry plead for anything like this. Elizabeth put a hand on Richard's arm, her eyes wet. "Richard, listen to him," she whispered. "Please." For a brief moment Richard's stern mask cracked. His eyes glistened. He looked truly uncertain. The sight of his little boy in such distress, begging for Grace, cut straight through him. But pride is a stubborn thing. Richard blinked, and the uncertainty hardened back into prideful determination. He gently pried Henry's arms from around Grace. The boy screamed and kicked, reaching out for her. "No, Gracie!" Henry's cries echoed in the hall, each one like a dagger of guilt in Richard's chest. Richard's own voice was barely a whisper now. "Take him upstairs, Liz," he said. "Please." Elizabeth hesitated, then scooped Henry into her arms despite his squirming. "Mama, no, Gracie!" Henry wailed, arms outstretched toward Grace as he was carried up the stairs. Grace stood, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Henry," she called softly after him, her voice shaking. She wanted to chase after them, to tell Henry everything would be all right, but she knew she couldn't. Richard held the door open, unable to look at Grace directly. "Goodbye, Grace," he forced out, the words thick with conflicted emotions. With a shattered heart, Grace nodded. She grabbed her purse from the side table, her hands trembling, and stepped out into the chilly night. The heavy door closed behind her with a decisive thud, cutting off the sound of Henry sobbing. Grace stood on the porch in disbelief. A few hours ago, she had been reading bedtime stories to Henry, and now she was cast out like she meant nothing. As she walked slowly down the driveway, the mansion's lights blurred through her tears. She kept glancing back, hoping perhaps Richard would burst out, call her name, anything. But the house remained silent. Inside, Richard leaned against the closed door, listening to his son's muffled cries upstairs until they faded into hiccups and silence. The grandeur of the foyer felt cold and empty. Elizabeth descended halfway down the staircase, stopping when she saw Richard. Her eyes were red with outrage and sorrow. "How could you?" she asked in a broken whisper. "He was finally happy. Can't you see that?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? He rubbed a hand over his face. "It's for his own good," he managed quietly. "He'll adjust. It's better this way. Better to make a change now." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. "For whose good? His or your pride?" she shot back. Richard had no answer. Elizabeth shook her head at him, a look of disappointment he'd never seen from her before. Cradling the plush dinosaur Henry had dropped, she turned and went back up to comfort their son, leaving Richard alone. Richard stood in the dim foyer, his reflection in the glass of the door staring back at him. He told himself he wouldn't second-guess his decision. He was a man who made hard choices in business. He thought this should be no different. And yet, as he stood there in the silence of his magnificent home, Richard Beaumont had never felt more unsure. Have you ever witnessed pride get in the way of doing the right thing? Share your thoughts in the comments. Later that night, a heavy silence fell over the Beaumont mansion. Henry had finally cried himself to sleep, clutching his plush dinosaur. Guilt-ridden, Richard hovered by his son's bed. He gently brushed a curl from Henry's damp forehead. "I'm sorry, little man," he whispered, heart aching. He hoped his son's peaceful breaths meant the worst was over. He was wrong. Shortly after midnight, a small whimper broke the quiet. Richard, who had nodded off in an armchair nearby, jolted awake. Henry was still asleep, but his face was pinched in distress. Suddenly, the boy's body went limp. Richard's stomach dropped. "Henry?" he called softly, touching the child's shoulder. No response. Then he realized with mounting terror that Henry's chest wasn't moving. The little boy wasn't breathing. Panic seized Richard. "Henry! Henry, wake up!" he shouted, scooping his son into his arms. Henry's head lolled back, his lips growing an eerie blue. Elizabeth came running at Richard's cries. One look at Henry's limp body, and she paled. "Oh, God, what's happening?" she gasped. Richard laid Henry on the floor, hands shaking violently. He fumbled for his phone and dialed 911, his voice cracking as he shouted, "My son isn't breathing. Please, hurry!" The dispatcher began giving instructions, but Richard's mind was in chaos. He started pressing on Henry's small chest, trying to recall the CPR training he barely remembered. 1, 2, 3. "Breathe, Henry. Please," he pleaded, tilting the boy's head and giving a desperate breath. His normally steady hands were clumsy and weak with fear. Henry's body remained lifeless. Elizabeth knelt beside her husband, tears streaming as he pumped their son's chest. "Where are they?" Richard cried out, meaning the ambulance. Every second felt like an eternity. Elizabeth suddenly grabbed her own phone with trembling fingers and made another call. The only other person she could think of, Grace. Across town, Grace was wide awake in her small apartment, eyes red and swollen from crying. The sight of Henry reaching out for her kept replaying in her mind. When her phone rang just after midnight, she snatched it up immediately. "Hello?" she answered, voice shaky. "Grace." It was Elizabeth, and she was frantic. "It's Henry. He's not breathing. We called 911, but please, we need you now." Grace's heart nearly stopped. She didn't even put on shoes. Still in her slippers and pajamas, she raced out the door and into her car. As she tore through the empty streets, hazard lights flashing, she kept whispering, "Hold on, Henry. I'm coming, sweetheart, I'm coming." Back at the mansion, Richard was still desperately performing CPR. "Come on, buddy, come on," he choked out, tears blurring his vision. Henry lay unresponsive, his face pallid. Richard felt despair crashing over him. He had never been so terrified. At last, the front door burst open. Grace rushed in, breathless and wide-eyed, and dropped to her knees beside Henry. "Oh, Henry!" she cried, her voice breaking at the sight of the boy's limp form. She checked for a pulse on his neck. There was none. Without wasting a second, Grace positioned her hands and began CPR. "Let me take over," she said firmly. Richard, shock and relief mingling on his face, scrambled back to make room. He watched, trembling, as Grace pressed on Henry's chest with the confident, measured rhythm of a trained nurse. The room was eerily quiet, except for Elizabeth's soft sobs and Grace's steady counting. Richard stood over them, his hands clamped over his mouth, praying harder than he ever had in his life. His world was collapsing, and the only person who could save it was the woman he had sent away. After several tense rounds of compressions, a tiny cough escaped Henry's lips, then a weak, shuddering inhale. "He's breathing!" Grace exclaimed, quickly turning Henry onto his side as the boy's body fought for air. Henry's chest rose and fell in shallow, fragile breaths, but it moved. Richard let out a cry that was half laugh, half sob. Elizabeth nearly collapsed in relief, whispering, "Oh, thank God," over and over. Henry's eyes fluttered open, glassy and confused. The first face he saw was Grace's. "Gracie?" he mumbled, barely audible. Grace laughed through her tears. "I'm here, sweet boy," she soothed, gently cradling his head with a shaking hand. "You're okay. Just keep breathing, Henry." Red lights began flashing through the windows as the ambulance roared up the driveway. Moments later, 2 EMTs rushed in. Grace was calm and efficient, already giving them Henry's vitals. Oxygen mask on, little chest still rising and falling. Henry was alive. One of the paramedics, seeing Grace's composure in blue scrubs, realized what had happened and gave her a respectful nod. "Good save," he said quietly. Richard stood back, trembling from head to toe as the medics worked. His son was alive, saved by Grace's hands. The weight of gratitude and guilt was almost too much to bear. He felt Elizabeth's arm wrap around him. She was crying and smiling at Grace at the same time. Richard's own tears fell freely now. He had nearly lost everything, and the very person he'd pushed away was the one who had saved his boy. If you believe in miracles and the power of kindness, don't forget to subscribe. Within minutes, the paramedics were ready to transport Henry. Elizabeth climbed into the ambulance beside her son, never letting go of his hand. Richard started to follow, then paused. His eyes fell on Grace, who stood at the foot of the driveway, face streaked with tears and worry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard approached her slowly, his composure finally crumbling. "Grace," he said hoarsely, I don't have the words." His voice broke, and this proud, controlled man began to sob openly. "Thank you. You saved my boy's life. I was so wrong about everything." Grace felt tears in her own eyes. She had seen many parents in pain before, but never a father so completely humbled. "Henry is going to be all right, Mr. Beaumont," she said softly, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "That's what matters." Richard shook his head, remorse etched into his face. "It matters that I nearly cost him his life because of my pride. I'm sorry for how I treated you. You were right about Henry, and I was too blind to see it." He wiped his wet cheeks with his sleeve. "If you can forgive me, I'd be honored to have you back. But even if you won't, I needed you to know how grateful I am." Grace managed a small, warm smile through her tears. "Of course I forgive you," she whispered. "Henry's well-being is all I care about. I'll always be there for him." "Sir, we have to go now," a paramedic called from the ambulance. Richard glanced between Grace and the ambulance where his son waited. He made a quick decision. "Come with us," he urged. "Please." Grace didn't hesitate. They climbed into the ambulance together, Richard gently helping her up. The door shut, and the ambulance sped into the night, its siren wailing a lullaby of hope. Inside, Grace held Henry's hand, and Richard held Henry's other hand. The little boy, still dazed but alive, looked up at them. He gave a weak smile that broke their hearts and healed them at the same time. Elizabeth, sitting by Henry's side, looked at Grace as if she were an angel who had saved their family. In that moment, Richard understood what true strength and compassion were. It wasn't about control or strict rules. It was about love, understanding, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. He had almost lost everything that mattered, but fate had given him a second chance. Moral: respect and love aren't determined by wealth or status, but by character and heart. Sometimes the real heroes in our lives are the very people we push away. And if we're fortunate, they might return and save us when we need them most.